Well, last week, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmer, announced a raid on the $230 billion future fund so money can be invested into areas of government priority like renewable energy schemes and residential housing.
But I've been very clear, I think probably half a dozen times here already. We're not changing its primary focus on returns. We're not changing its independence when it comes to investment decisions that the board makes. It's not unusual. It shouldn't be controversial for a government to indicate its priorities. We haven't seen major changes like this to the future fund since its inception, and there's not many institutions that would expect to go for 2 or 3 or 4 decades without anybody having a view about how you could improve them. That's what today's about.
Well, joining me now to discuss this is economist Dr. Rod St Hill. Rod, welcome. Butter wouldn't melt in the Treasurer's mouth. Nothing to see here, apparently.
Apparently not. Well, he's right that there haven't been any changes made to the investment warrant since the inception of the fund way back in 2006. That was back in the good old days, mind you, when mining was a good thing. And in the first decade of the 2000s, of course, governments were making sizable surpluses. Some of that surplus, $60.5 billion, in fact, was set aside for the future fund, primarily for the purpose of funding future superannuation payments to Commonwealth public servants and to retired members of the ADF. And it was charged with making a rate of return around 4.5% to 5.5% higher than the annual rate of inflation. And it's actually succeeded in doing that really very well since it was first instituted in 2006. And so now we have a government coming in and saying, well, look, we want to modify this and we want the fund to invest in so-called national priorities, for which I read political priorities. And these are things that the government no longer wants to fully fund on its annual budget. In other words, they want to hide it from people.
So they are making a raid on this very important, sovereign wealth fund people have referred it to. I'm glad you explained the purpose of it. It covers the Commonwealth public servants' pensions and the Defence Force pensions. Really important that that's funded properly. But if the government's now changing these priorities so that it can put money into, green energy schemes and residential housing, what effect is that likely to have on the returns of the fund?
Most likely, in the long term, it will reduce the average rate of return. It's as simple as that.
Now, is that because the sorts of national priorities that Jim Chalmer has identified, political priorities, as you, I think, rightly said, that these are unlikely to be return-generating ventures? They're likely to be loss makers?
Well, look, essentially, if they were really good investments, the private sector would be there already in spades, and they're not. Government is having to fund these areas. Look, housing is one of those areas which is really a government responsibility. Our problem at the moment and for the foreseeable future is lack of supply. No matter what you tell the investment fund to do, it's not actually going to be able to alleviate the housing crisis.
Yeah, so really the issue there has got to be releasing more land, getting rid of red tape.
Absolutely.
That sort of thing.
We've got to deal with the supply side. Absolutely, Lyle, 100%.
Yeah, rather than throwing money after it. My concern with the green energy schemes that he seems to want to spend future fund money on is that if there is to be a return on those sort of investments, that would have to come off the back of your and my electricity bills, wouldn't it?
Well, that's what's happening now and will for the foreseeable future. There's no doubt about it. The cost of the transition to renewables is much higher than certainly the government anticipated. The sorts of figures that are being thrown around now are $650 billion. And look, that's huge. That is absolutely huge. And as I said, if these things were good, profitable investments, the private sector would be undertaking this in spades.
Yeah, well,
and they're not.
That's right. But look, I guess my point is, and I'm no economist, that's why I've got you on the show, Rod, but if money's to be invested from the future fund into, windmills and solar panels, surely any return that they might generate comes from the hip pockets of people who pay electricity bills.
Well, we're putting pretty sizable subsidies into these things. So you're quite right. Ultimately, we are the ones who are going to pay for this folly. There's no doubt about it.
So the future fund, people might say, well, that's just a big pot of money for public servants' retirement and Defence Force retirement. But how does the government's raid on this fund, how could that then affect other Australian taxpayers?
Well, currently, those pensions are being paid out of the general revenue of the government, which is funded by general taxation. So company tax and income tax are what funds it currently. The idea of the future fund was that a long, long way into the future, this fund will be large enough and making large enough returns to take on that responsibility.
So to be self-sustaining,
so that would no longer
essentially.
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
Rod, it seems...
So we pay for it. Taxpayers pay for it.
Yeah, and so we're going to be paying even more because these will be dud
That's
investments.
correct.
Yeah. Rod, it seems the Albanese government is clearing the deck for a possible early election. It seems to be taking a leaf out of the failed strategies of the Queensland Labor government, where you're based up there, offering free stuff to try and buy votes at the election. Notably, we've seen a partial write-off of student debt. Now, this is only likely to further fuel inflation and make the cost of living crisis worse, isn't it?
Oh, it will. It'll probably have a fairly minor effect. But look, I think there are ethical issues surrounding this, and it's just not fair that some people should be able to get off some of their debt. What about the people who've already paid their debt? They get no benefit at all. I don't think it's a good policy at all. It shouldn't be happening, and it is costly.
Yeah, and it's throwing taxpayers' money at buying votes at a time when we've got a debt approaching $1 trillion.
Yes, it is.
Rod, speaking of government spending, we've seen media reports in the last week or so that show the growth in the Commonwealth Public Service. 26,000 new public servants since the Anthony Albanese government came to office. Many of them, or a large percentage of them, in climate change sort of jobs. Labor's staff spending spree has added an eye-watering additional $5 billion in recurrent spending at a time when, as I said before, our debt is approaching $1 trillion. Is it possible to take the government seriously on cost of living when its spending seems to be out of control?
Well, look, they have priorities. They know they're not going to be in for all that long, 2 terms at best, quite possibly 1 term now. So they're rushing headlong to get their pet policies in place at the cost of high inflation. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, but that level of public servants and the increase in staff that the Commonwealth is paying for, that has to have an inflationary effect, doesn't it, as government expenditure increases?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We should be trimming government spending in total, not increasing it. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, so the government's pinned its hopes on a interest rate cut early in the new year so that it can go to an election claiming its economic policies are working. But what hope do you think, given the level of government spending and its contribution to inflation, is there of such a cut early in the new year?
Look, I wouldn't be banking on an interest rate cut until midway through last year.
Through next year.
Not last year, sorry.
Yep.
Through next year. I don't really think we're going to get much before the election, that's for sure.
That'll be a disappointment to the Labor political strategists. Rod,
it will be. The Reserve Bank has been resolute in fighting inflation because they know the long-term consequences of it.
Yeah, you and I have spoken about this before, but to me it seems terribly unfair that people with mortgages have to bear the brunt of the inflation fighting while the government goes on its merry way with undisciplined spending, which also contributes to inflation.
Well, look, as a professional economist, I consider this kind of economic vandalism as moral failure. And I think we're seeing moral failure on the part of the government. They refuse to cut their spending. In fact, they're expanding spending. We're going to be left with a government which is much larger as a size of our economy than was the case under the previous government. And when government grows, it is very, very hard to trim it down. And I think ultimately we'll get to the point where we have to make massive changes, and that will hurt everybody, including the public servants who lose their jobs. And I think that's inevitable in the longer term.
Yeah, we're creating real problems. It really does make their rhetoric about fighting the cost of living and caring about people's pain with their bills around the kitchen table seem very hollow. Rod, I guess there's a different approach being tried now since the election in the US. We've had Biden economics for the past 4 years. Trump has come to power in January next year, promising cuts to regulation, cuts to taxes. He's promising tariffs on goods from China and possibly elsewhere. He's going to drill, baby, drill. Does all this augur for a brighter economic outlook in the US and possibly globally?
It certainly does for the US, and we saw some of that during his first term. America did very well in his first term, and I think we will see that again. The only concern I have would be with his policies at the border in terms of tariffs. I'm reasonably sanguine about it. I don't think it's going to have as large an impact as some people are predicting, but we should have a little bit of a concern about that as to whether Australian exports to the United States might end up coming under the umbrella of his tariff policies. But certainly, as far as the USA internally is concerned, I think his presidency is going to be a very good thing, just as it was in his first term.
Yeah, interesting. Hopefully there's something there for Australian policymakers to follow, and perhaps if we get a change of government. But you mentioned tariffs. During Trump's first term, he did exempt Australian steel from tariffs. We were pretty much exempt last time. Hopefully that'll be the case. Kevin Rudd's got a bit of work to do there as ambassador to the US. But just on tariffs generally, do you know, there's a school in economics, and the orthodoxy for the last probably 20 or 30 years has been they're wrong. We should have complete and utter free trade. There should be no tariffs, regardless of what China might do in terms of subsidising its local industries. Is that your view as an economist?
Look, my view's changed a little bit in the last few years, but based on the evidence, what's happened with globalisation, certainly in the United States and most other Western economies, is that, yes, our GDP has grown quite spectacularly. Even on a GDP per capita basis, it has grown overall, but jobs have disappeared and not been replaced. So there's this great hollowing out in the middle, where people who didn't necessarily have high levels of education and so on, they were able to work in factories. That's just not there anymore. And so in America, in Australia, the UK, many other economies, we have a large portion of the population that have ended up becoming dependent upon government for their sustenance because they simply can't find work that is ideal for them. So that's one of the problems. The other is it's hard to know whether we've actually become better off in terms of our overall level of satisfaction with life and so on as a result of globalisation. And the most recent survey on Australian satisfaction puts it at a historic low. So we're better off financially on average, but we don't seem to be any happier as a result. So I'd be fairly cautious now about lauding the benefits of absolutely free trade, but I would be careful about the policies that we adopt in terms of modifying free trade.
But on the whole, Rod, you think if an Australian government took the Trump approach, cut regulations, cut taxes, allowed energy to be explored and developed more readily, that would perhaps take us to another level economically and relieve some of the cost of living pressure that we're facing?
Look, Lyle, our endowment as a nation of our natural resources, we've got coal, we've got gas, we've got iron ore, and we've got agriculture based on grazing animals. So we produce a lot of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and we produce a lot of methane as well. That's because of our natural endowment. And I actually think that we shouldn't give up the benefits of our natural endowment in order to reduce our own contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. So yes, I agree with the sentiment behind drill, baby, drill. We should be doing a lot more of it. We can certainly cut our greenhouse gas emissions even if we continue to use coal as our primary source for electricity generation, if we use gas, and ultimately use nuclear power stations. I think we've got a very bright future if we focus on cheap and reliable electricity rather than building a whole system on renewables. They have a place. I think solar and wind has a place, but it can never really replace that sort of bulk electricity that we currently still generate through coal-fired power stations. So, look, we should be developing the resources that we have. We should be proud of our agricultural sector. Look, I think the war on agriculture over the last few years by both federal and state governments is reprehensible. And we have a natural endowment that lends ourselves to grazing cattle and sheep, and we should continue to do so. And we should continue to build successful export industries on that basis.
Well, Rod, that's why I always love talking to you, because it seems like there's no reason why Australia should have a cost of living crisis. It seems entirely politician-induced. Let's hope that we get some better policies on the other side of the next election. Rod, really appreciate your time today.
You're very welcome indeed, Lyle.